Layman with Bruce and Rick. All three of us have spent time exploring meditative practices as well as pondering what meditation is and what it does, both practically and philosophically. I think we're all aware of some of the problems, like plausible distinctions between meditative states and meditational activity, the intense ambiguity of a term that purports to cover everything from intensified thinking to the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind stuff. So I'm excited to see where this conversation goes. I think maybe I could reach into my personal thoughts and open up some cans of worms for us at the beginning here. I looked up types of meditation on the internet the other day, and I got a whole host of really superficial results, like what are the 5 best types? What are the 7 types? What are the 12 types? Top 16 meditations. It all had a very, cover of Cosmo and Teen Beat magazine kind of feel to it.
I had the same experience, Layman, when I figured, let me go Google this. It's like, oh my God.
The results were a little bit better when I looked for neurological styles of meditation. So obviously the researchers have to try to clarify which external correlates they're thinking about. But even then, there's a lot of pop science, junk science, vagueness about which data they can or should be checking. And for me, a certain gullibility about the typologies they've heard about because they haven't necessarily investigated it philosophically themselves. I found that terms like transcendental meditation and vipassana and mindfulness, which could be very meaningful concepts, seem to lose that meaningfulness in their social deployment, and they get glossed over. And I think what's especially lost there is that there are different translations, different interpretations, and different functional modes that can exist under any of these terms. I was thinking about one of my favorite koans is there's a visitor in the adept, and they're watching 2 identically dressed monks sitting in identical positions doing their meditation. They finish up, they get up, they roll up their mats, they leave. The adept turns to the visitor and says, one of them has it, one of them doesn't. So I love it because it brings together that intimate conjunction of sameness and difference that I think is at the heart of the koans and maybe of ontology as well. But also it points out this thing that you run into in the life of meditation, which is you have no idea from the outside if 2 people who appear to be doing the same thing and say they're doing the same thing are actually doing the same thing. So there's all these hidden potential distinctions that are very hard to get at because people are not great phenomenological self-reporters. Very often people don't want to talk about their meditation practice with any kind of intellectual acuity. When they do talk about it, they often just regurgitate the introductory instructions they first heard from a particular methodology teacher. And although everybody says to you that meditation is great and it's an important part of their life and they should be doing it more, almost nobody takes that conversation further. We don't even know most of the time if 2 people who are talking about meditation are talking about the same thing. So I'm really interested in probing those hidden differences, in seeing what we each have as a kind of generalized notion of what the broad container definition of meditation might be, how we've experienced the different categorization options, and also like how do we know which bits of which practices are causing which effects? I use this email address, pretend to meditate, because clearly some of the positive effects of meditation are achieved merely through the posture and context, which could therefore be activated by simply pretending to do it. But which effects and to what degree? I've also I would teach a technique called don't meditate, where I'd ask people to sit down and close their eyes and for 10 minutes, make sure they don't engage in any meditation at all. And so the joke is, it's obviously a meditation technique at the behavioral level, even though it's the opposite of a meditation technique at the socio-mental content level. So to what degree can we separate out what a person thinks they're doing from what's actually going on in a successful meditation? And what does successful even mean in a meditation? So for me, that's like my introductory slice through of various cans of wriggling worms. I would say my general definition is any sustained or repeated intentional deployment of attention in the context of self-refinement, self-understanding, or self-transcendence. So that's all my intro. Maybe I've opened up some problems. Let's pass it on to somebody else who isn't me. How about you, Rick?
Sure. I love the koan, and I love the non-meditation instructions thing. I want to hear more about that. I'm curious what those practitioners say after they do that. It sounds to me like they're meditating in some way, shape, or form. I love the idea that the meditation instructions can be completely opposite and might even bring about the same effect. It might be the case that don't meditate brings about better states of meditation. That's my intuition. Yeah, I love your tentative, kind of rule of thumb about what you think meditation might be described as. Intentional practices geared towards some kind of self, cultivation or transformation. One thought that I had just looking over my own writings on this while preparing for this was I made an analogy. I'm not sure if you're familiar with, I agree with everything that you said. Everything is so problematic. So it's going to be piecemeal. I'm not going to be integrating anything off the bat. That might happen in the conversation. But one of the ideas I wanted to share about the impact that it's had on me, it's kind of like what Dennett calls intuition pumps. Are you familiar with this phraseology? Okay, so for the audience, it might be a thought experiment, like just a quick explanation, a sample. What if you're really just a brain in a vat, or you're really just in a simulated world, like the Matrix? Is there anything inside your experience, your subjectivity, that you could point to that could show that you're not? And if you can't, because it's all possibly programmed by, whoever's in control, then you don't really know anything, right? So that's an intuition pump, right? It doesn't solve, it doesn't prove skepticism is true or anything like that, but it gets people into seeing a problem from a kind of inside what it would be like to be stuck in that space. And meditation has that power for me. It's kind of like, and so instead of intuition pump, I call it a kind of consciousness raising pump, because you can play around with different meditation techniques, and you're in what John Vervaeke, who talks about the 4 different P's, there's propositional knowing. So different procedures, different meditative procedures put you into participation in alternate ways of being and experiencing, and then you have altered perspectives. So it's like intuition pumps. It's had that, not all of them, but many of my meditation experiences, the exceptional ones, have really altered my figure ground gestalt kind of sense of myself in the world, or agent arena relationship, whatever, that sort of thing. But that's at the high end, exceptional experiences. A lot of meditative experiences are just mundane, no different from washing dishes mindfully or something like that. So yeah, the spectrum of things that count as meditative, that depends on the person, Anything that you do can be done in a kind of mindless or mindful way, right? So there's that spectrum. All human activities can be the object of focus or the object of meditative awareness. So that makes it really problematic trying to kind of generalize about what makes them meditative. And then there's techniques that produce these transformative figure ground shifts, and then there's these ho-hum ones. And one of the things I like to joke about in one of my writings is Robert Nozick's got a kind of intuition pump against meditation, where he says, what if it's just like a soundless stereo? The turntable is turning, the speakers are on, but the stylus is not touching the record, right? So what if it's just like, that's what happens when you damp down the cognitive apparatus? It's just not making any noise. There's no music or whatever. There's nothing special. It's just ho-hum, right? So but is it om or is it ho-hum, right? And om and ho-hum, hum and om are pretty much almost the same thing. So, but just that question also kind of presupposes this metaphysical importance of this dualistic conception about things being spiritual or not. And even that is kind of something to be looked at both philosophically and experientially meditatively, because sometimes you can't differentiate between them, particularly if you're in a flow state, just washing dishes or walking down the street or whatever it is. So those are just some of the thoughts I would throw out there to get the ball rolling on my end, and pass it over maybe now.
Terrific. What's your introductory mind scramble, Bruce?
Yeah, sorry, that was a mind scramble.
I definitely have a mind scramble to deliver too, with a side of hash browns. I was looking at this concept of meditation too, and I actually had the same experience as both of you of deciding to Google types of meditation to see what's out there, and I got exactly the same Cosmo kind of list. Not very helpful. And thinking just about meditation itself, as we've all both been saying, it's such a loosely applied word, and Layman and I have talked about in other contexts, if we're thinking about something like religion, or even any particular discipline, sometimes it's used in such a loose way, or such a overly saturated way, that it's really, you're not sure if you're always looking at the same family of things. And so there are a lot of things that can go under the name meditation, and maybe they fit and maybe they don't, or maybe if we begin to push a little bit deeper into this, we might find some family resemblances that break down some of the familiar boundaries and establish some others. So I'm interested to see where we go with this. And I was thinking, almost of I was playing with almost a typology of typologies. Like, if we're going to make a typology of meditation, what kind of typology are we looking at? Are we looking at a functionalist one, or a metaphysical one, or one that's rooted in traditional assumptions and definitions around meditation? There's a lot of ways that you could approach that, so we can talk that through. And one thing that I was thinking about, maybe as a possible framing in terms of thinking about the whole religious territory, where there is kind of intentional spiritual practice aimed at ethical upgrading in some sense, and or personal transformation, acquisition of new powers, and or clearing of obstructions. So there's a whole range of things that are done, but under the general umbrella of spiritual transformative traditions. A guy named Rawlinson has a typology which looks at types of traditions. And so one thing I wanted to think about, and even putting that out there, is meditation something that covers that whole territory, or is it something that's more found in just a couple of the traditions within that religious territory? So briefly, the taxonomy there is, he makes a differentiation between hot and cool traditions, and structured and unstructured traditions, and he can make a quadrant grid with that. A hot tradition is one that recognizes a distinction between a self and an other, an agent and other powers, and there's a kind of a heat of relationship and engagement and interaction that goes on, whereas a cool tradition is more internal and self-oriented. So within Zen, you can think about other power and self-power, Tariki and Jiriki, where there's the distinction between, there's that, even if in like Advaita, whether it's Advaita or Vishishtadvaita, where there's either the pure fullness of and just resting in self-presence, or if there's always that gap with the other, and there's that heat there. So that's the hot and cool traditions. And then there are the structured and unstructured. And structured, of course, see a journey, they see a progression, they see stages and initiatory thresholds and levels of attainment and a path that you follow. Whereas the unstructured will say you're already there. They'll point to your being, the goal, right? And there's not really any path to travel, or there's not any. Sometimes it's emotionally framed that it's just you need to be, if it's like a hot unstructured tradition, basically there's a self-other relationship, but there's no path. It's just basically you have to receive the master's grace. You have to be forgiven and saved by the other, right? And there's no path for you to follow. There's nothing that you do that achieves the result. Whereas like some esoteric or tantric traditions, those are hot structured, often where there's a deities and powers that you interact with and very clear journey that you go on, right? So a lot of the meditation that we talk about, those traditions that we talk about, they seem to fit more neatly into the cool structured and cool unstructured. Cool structured would be something like, Hinayana path, where ultimately you follow a set of steps, and there's a gradual attainment, and there's a path to get there, but ultimately you're realizing and clarifying your own condition on that journey. Whereas something like Dzogchen would be a cool unstructured tradition where it's basically it's non-meditation. It's a profound letting go and allowing the arising of a rikpa of its own, self-liberation of the elements within the expanse of consciousness, right? So there's not really, even though you can't firmly lay it out that way because Tantra and Dzogchen mix and they play with different elements, but these establish a kind of broad territory, right? And so what's your sense about that for either of you in terms of, if we're thinking about meditation, does it fall more fully into one or two of those orientations, or is it a term that we could probably successfully use across that whole expanse?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm thinking of a passage in a Rajneesh book that I read as a kid, and the title was "Meditation is Cool." He meant it in like the McLuhan sense of a cool medium. I think he also talked about, he contrasted Sufism and Zen as like masculine and feminine styles, but right, so one is, that would be like a hot and cold in the way you were talking about it. I suspect we would want to broaden the definition a little bit beyond that. Like, I think perhaps we've culturally sampled or foregrounded only particular types for some reasons, right? And that we've been attracted to the image of the seated meditator and the notion of mindfulness and things like that. But that whatever the underlying dynamical process is might well apply to some of those hot processes as well.
Yeah, that's my intuition as well. The hot processes, I love this distinction, by the way, these two pairs, hot and cold, structured and not. I think it captures a lot. It's a really good way of classifying a whole bunch of differences. Excellent. Maybe you'll put the link in the show notes or something. Rawlinson, you said?
Yes.
Yeah, really good. Yeah, I agree with Layman. If there would be a reason to think that it didn't apply to the hot stuff, etc., it would be because we've culturally, adopted a certain paradigm based on the popularity of, the seated, lotus posed, eyelids closed, model of. But there's that koan, one of them's got it and the other one doesn't. Love that koan. Yeah.
I want to say I liked the idea, Rick, of a like a metacognition pump. And it would be interesting to think about what the specific thing is that causes the pumping action. In Nozick's notion of the soundless radio, it makes me think of the tendency to point to the default mode network in the brain. Early studies on the default mode network thought of it as essentially passive, like the radio without the sound on. But what I'm seeing in the research more recently is activity applied internally still activates those same circuits. So there's something much more specific going on, or possible, that can go on, right? It's not just that the sound's off, it's that periodically when the sound's off, something happens, right? Some other noise comes through the radio, like you were saying. What kind of sound off is it?
Yeah, ohm or hum or ho hum. Is it just a hum of the equipment, or is it something more meaningful? Or is there just the hum of the equipment? Is just becoming aware of the hum of your own consciousness enough? It doesn't have to be something spectacular, like I hear the ohm, that kind of thing. Like Hess in Siddhartha, he talks about when the sage finally hears the ohm. I remember, speaking of one has it and one doesn't, I went to this initiation once in Kriya Yoga with a certain Swami whose name I won't mention because I'm going to be critical of him. And we were all sitting there, and he had us all we were sitting with eyes closed, trying to hear the Om. And he was going around to each person saying, "Do you hear it?" And he was an Indian man with the Swami clothes and all that. And everybody was saying, "Yes, yes, yes." And when he got to me, I said, "No." He said, "No, listen more carefully," or something like that. And, "Do you hear it now?" And it was like a social pressure thing, like peer pressure. And I just kept saying no. So finally he put his fingers in my ears and squeezed. He said, "Do you hear it now?" And I said, "No, that's not the Om." Speaking of funny personal experiences, one has it and one doesn't. But did they really have it, or were they just peer pressured? Because I felt peer pressured to say yes, but I wasn't going to lie about something like that.
There's a mixture there of peer pressure and how are you interpreting normal phenomenon, right? Like there is some kind of static, or there's an acoustic space around the ear and things like that. You're hearing that background noise. Is that the Om, or is it some specific thing? And that specific thing, is it being produced and so it's there sometimes, or is it some fundamental background quality?
Right.
Bruce, what's your take on the question you asked about whether it falls into the cool zones more than the hot zones?
I think most of our studies tend to focus on the cool zones. I can think about, in terms of our own general orientation, you and me, Layman, where we're immersed a lot in integral thinking. And Wilber, in his own work, tends to emphasize the cool traditions, the cool structured and unstructured, more than the hot ones. He doesn't talk very much about shamanism or magic or tantra. He doesn't really give that the same attention, right? So I think but beyond just the Wilberian context, there's a lot of places where I think investigations of meditation tend to focus on the cool, structured and unstructured more often than others. But my sense is it can apply to all of them. One way I think about meditation, I have a term that I call generative enclosure, and I use it kind of loosely. But generative enclosure is basically the establishment of a container that, in the erection of those boundaries, it marks a difference that begins to make a difference, right? Autopoetically and in other ways, you can think about the establishment of a enclosure leads to certain kinds of disclosure, and practice routines and injunctions and intentional sets. All of those things can begin to establish that kind of enclosure, those conditions in which some kind of change can happen. And so I think very clearly, you can see that in the hot structured traditions, it's less clear exactly what they are in the hot unstructured. But I think even then there's a kind of a priming of the whole arena, the whole social territory, to dispose you towards having certain types of experiences and noticing certain things and surrendering certain aspects of yourself. So it still is the establishment of enough of a boundary in which psychophysical changes can take place. And so I was thinking about what are some of the functions of this establishment of these generative enclosures. Some that I just was pulling out of the air pretty much. This isn't scientific or robust, philosophically robust yet, but I was thinking about calming, production of insight or gnosis, production of absorption or one-pointedness, identification with another, clearing or obstructing something that's in the way of the realization of something, the generation of desired qualities. There's different practices for cultivating, the for Brahma Viharas and things like that, purifying, transmuting, different alchemical and internal transformational circulation of energies and transformation of self-structure, surrender and communion, and different kinds of state access and stabilization in states. So I can see generative enclosures functioning in that way within all of those domains.
Yeah, I think it's probably easier to do a typology of the motivations than of the dynamics, right? Like when I was listening to that list, I thought, yeah, okay, sure. But then I thought, to what degree are the procedures involved in training one-pointed concentration different than the procedures involved in cultivating and producing a particular, let's say, feeling quality?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I know that the neuroimaging studies have tended to show that focusing on loving kindness and focusing on a visual object all sort of rev up the left prefrontal cortex zones, because they're both involved in sustaining a selected attentional focus. So we might have a typology that looks different at the level of motives, but looks very similar at the level of practice.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I was thinking about. We're going to probably find these families that overlap in different ways, and that's some things that look like they're grouped together under certain conditions are actually not the same under other conditions, or if you're looking at another element.
Yeah, and that's motivation is part of context, but it's not all of context. So worldview, expectations, understanding of, what is this all about, that feeds into what's a rational motive to have when creating one of these generative enclosures. I like that analysis. It's a nice little way of zeroing in on something important going on. No matter what the methodology is, it's kicking in this functionality that is this generative enclosure, which without constraints, there's combinatorial explosion about what the affordances are. So, but what structures the different generative enclosures differently is not with motive, but motive might be more an effect of like in the Eightfold Path. The first thing is right view. So view determines intention. What you think is worth pursuing determines what you want, right? So it gets complicated, but I have a tendency in my mind. I love the fact that these models are coming up, but I'm also seeing the explosive. I like the idea that I think you're right, Layman. It might be easier to do a typology of motivations and a typology of procedures. And you're both right that you could have the same. He's got it and he doesn't. Even with almost all the different factors motive, procedure, all sorts of things. There could be just some idiolectical thing about the individual or about that particular teacher or whatever. That there are things that are picked up by osmosis in spiritual communities that are tacit learning, right? I mean, I remember that from being in spiritual communities. Everybody's acting a certain way in this community, but what's causing that? And you might never figure it out, but there's something going on. There are norms being transmitted about, and norms have value implications, and they have metaphysical, worldviews that they connect with that might be all tacit. So how do we track and taxonomize?
It grows, right? Like Zen is a great example, right? The existence of different lineages that to the outsider look the same and refer to the same source material and use a lot of the same verbal descriptions for what they're doing. And yet the reason the lineages exist is that some tacit shared experience of interpreting and applying those things has become different from how some of the other people are doing it. And so that's very interesting as well, to consider it as a branching. Are there places where it reconverges because the tacit context is the same? How much fluidity is implied in these processes, and do we think of them as, like, if you set a practice lineage in motion and left it over time, would it naturally diversify to the point where it basically finds all of the different procedural options or tacit interpretal variations? Could you just run it? Would it find it like rats going through a maze? or how does this thing work?
That's a great idea. Yeah. I mean, well, when you look back over history, I mean, that's what happened, obviously. And with martial arts, with yoga, with all sorts of different practice traditions that may or may not be meditative at all. You get these, just look at the different versions of Christianity or, whatever.
It would be very easy, because it is combinatorially explosive, to sort of throw our hands up and be like, well, we'll never figure it out because there's so many different variations, but there might be underlying structures. Bruce, I'm wondering from your point of view whether you think basic grammatical forms might display like an underlying ontological structure of options that different lineages, as they diversify and mutate, find these underlying structures, but we might be able to psycholinguistically describe what's down there.
Yes, I was thinking about that, and I didn't really develop much along those lines in terms of my note taking yesterday, but I definitely was thinking in that direction. One of the reasons why I wanted to bring in Rawlinson's taxonomy is it covers such a wide religious and spiritual practice territory with some very clear differences. Usually the ones in the opposite corners are the traditions that have the hardest time communicating with each other. And so if we could find some classification schema that could apply across a territory that vast, that might give us a sense of being able to tame some of that explosiveness. In terms of the grammatical elements, there are different ways to approach it. I tend to see, almost, I know that you want to talk a little bit about an evolutionary view of attention systems. So I want to kind of prime you for that, Layman. But I can see that, in early religious practice, there's much more of a nounal focus on an object, right? And
what kind of focus, Bruce? I'm sorry.
Nounal.
Oh, okay. Nounal. Okay.
Nounal. Yeah. Right.
Object oriented, yeah.
Object oriented, and the objects of power and fetishes and things like that. There's more to it than just that, because there's also this felt adjectival quality that imbues certain things. But you can look at different traditions like, Chittamatra, where they're only looking at everything as the flow of appearances. That could be conceived as a very adjectival orientation but certain practices which are focused more on, as like John likes to talk about, the here now togetherness, basically the arriving at a place of like very coherent manifesting of awareness and consciousness, that's more of an adverbial kind of approach. It's modal in that sense. It's establishing the modes of being. And so there's a certain privileging of certain kinds of modes. So that would be adverbial. Prepositional would be cultivation and navigation and circulation through different types of relational vectors, right? Establishing certain kinds of relational activities, whether it's the self-other of the supplicant and the deity, or the right relationship of the individual to the powers that surround you in the great medicine wheel of life. And all of that, there's this whole dancing through of prepositional relations, right? So I think you can dive into that and find a lot of different kinds of practices, but it's not something I've really tried to go into very much yet.
I think that before you go, Layman, because I know you have a lot more to say about it, I'll say what I can now. Otherwise, you'll probably say it, and then I'll have nothing to say. So, no, but I've heard you talk about this here and there, the grammar, the different grammar. And to me, immediately, the thing I was thinking of was, well, that's that tacit background metaphysical stuff that informs what's different about this group and its norms and its behaviors, right? That's the grammar. That's the metaphysical presuppositions at the grammatical level, there it is. Are we object-oriented, process-oriented,
Exactly, yeah. And that's been the emphasis of my project, is to look, even though I don't think it's limited to the parts of speech, I think there are other ways you can conceive of grammar much more broadly than literally using parts of speech.
Right.
But I've used the parts of speech because I think at least 6 of them that I've identified really help you trace out the contours of very basic metaphysical assumptions, whether it's substance oriented or process oriented or relational or perspectival. There's a whole range of those things that you can get from the pronouns and all of those different parts of speech. So those do set the broad territory, and we could even think of the kind of the hot and cool and the structured unstructured as a kind of grammar, and probably correlate them with grammatical distinctions as well.
I think this is a really rich philosophical avenue of research. As somebody trained in analytic philosophy is significantly informed by what's called ordinary language philosophy, which is just, well, what's already given to us in our grammar. But they didn't go into it the way you guys are going into it. Like, well, you know what? Prepositions say an awful lot about our metaphysics and so on. So, like, this is just really kind of combinatorially explosive, but in a constrained and really useful taxonomic way. I think it's a really fruitful lens to bring to this. And I think all the different lenses that have been brought in can and should be integrated in some way. But it's just, this is a big intellectual project.
Yeah, this grammar part is really important, I think, partly because it does with language-based philosophy what a lot of people have been doing in mathematics over the last couple of years, which is really refining it down to the basic types of logical operators and things like that. But also, I know there's an argument around meditation as to whether there are implied metaphysical backgrounds or not. Right? Some people say, well, you don't need any particular metaphysics to do a meditation practice. And generally speaking, that's true. But you can counter-argue against that and go, well, that's just a sales tactic. It's practical to tell people that. But in reality, there is an implied metaphysics that comes along with it. And between those positions, the real question strikes me is, what is the minimum metaphysical set of assumptions that are implied by successfully approaching meditation practice in some way, right? And how do we, fundamental grammar structures is one way to think about how you would get that, we say post-metaphysical, but really we mean some kind of updated minimal metaphysics. What's the least we need to believe?
Well, the first thing that you said about not having a metaphysics made me think immediately of those scientism folks who are philosophers of science who adopt, what is it called? Instrumentalism. All right, the theory and the data predict our technology and our expectations about future observations and retrodict the past ones, and the explanatory framework works, and that's enough. We don't need any metaphysics, right? And I'm not so sure I really accept that that's true.
No, from a socio-critical point of view, that's very suspicious, because the people who argue that they're holding the neutral position are enforcing something in the system.
Yeah.
It's interesting in Buddhism.
Yeah.
I'll just say a real
Yeah.
quick thing. In Buddhism, in contrast with Christianity, for instance, where in Christianity we're familiar with orthodoxy, right? But less of an emphasis on orthopraxy. And in Buddhism, it was the opposite in the early Buddhism. There was an orthopraxy. Everyone does the same basic set of practices across the communities, but there was not much concern about how you were interpreting them. They were more concerned that you carry out the procedures. And so what does that say around that orientation? Is that just an instrumentalist orientation or something else going on there?
It might just be a faith in the transformative power of the practices, a trust that those figure ground shifts that constitute sapiential growth are more important than the doxological, stuff that comes along with it. That's an optimistic way of looking at it. But yeah, there's this debate going on about the self in Buddhism, and free will and all that stuff that I dabble in, where, it's considered orthodox now, the view that there's no self as a primary axiomatic tenet, maybe if not the most, fundamental of, 2 or 3 truths that count the most in Buddhism. But on some historical interpretations, that group, the Pudgalavadins, Pudgala is a person, Vada, the path, the personalists, they were, according to Amber Carpenter and a couple of others who've written about them favorably, they were the largest minority of the early practice group communities in Buddhism. And their view about the self was that it was kind of indeterminate. It was something. There had to be something that was some kind of continuant, but it could have been a process. That didn't mean it was an object. But recently, I just did a book review of Mark Sideritz wrote a book about Buddhist metaphysics called How Things Are, where he actually describes the Pudgalavadin view as a heterodox Buddhist view, just because it differs from the received view today. And I thought, that's kind of slanted language to call that a heterodox view. That was one of the major earliest views. That's when people were all becoming enlightened, 500 at a time. And that's when you said the practice was more important, because the practice was working, whatever they were doing. or at least, well, we don't know, because we didn't have the Zen master there who could say he actually is enlightened and he's not. It could have been, yeah, I hear it.
No, that's an important distinction there around what's culturally received as the discourse. And very often that's meant to be a contrast, right? Like, we get to hold Buddhism up as saying as a religion that says there's no God and no self, as opposed to our Western religions. So that's a surface level story we tell. Yeah. People who are involved in practicing Buddhist communities find a much richer take. The communities I was involved in always talked in the sense of, the self is part of the interdependent co-arising. It doesn't have fundamental concrete essence any more than anything else does. So it's as real as everything else is, which is to say not real.
Right. But John Vervaeke and Greg Enriquez and Christopher Mastro Pietro recently did the Elusive I series. They made a big deal out of the equivocation in the metaphysics that, contemporary science is now using process metaphysics for everything. And, that's been in Buddhism. But there's some inequality in saying, there are tables and chairs and this and that. They're conventionally real. They're really just processes, but there's no self. But the self is just like everything else. It's interdependent and it's changing all the time. And that doesn't mean there's nothing there. When there's no thing there, but that, it's no different from a table or a chair or in anything else, a zebra or whatever.
Yeah, I wanted to thank Bruce for just now introducing me to the word orthopraxy.
I never heard that before. I got to write that down. That's a good. Is that a neologism of yours, or did you see it somewhere else?
Yeah, no, that was a word I got in my religious studies minor.
Oh,
in Austin, Texas.
It's a good word. I like it.
I think it's an interesting question what the metaphysical implications of orthopraxy are, because it seems like it could go in two directions. And the one that Rick was pointing to is, well, this stuff just works, which is what you hear all the time in practitioner communities. Just do it and then you'll change. You don't have to worry about believing something first. On the other hand, like that could all be embedded in a very everyday pragmatic metaphysics. On the other hand, it might reflect some much more elaborate relationship to ontology as process, or as procedure fundamentally preceding the things that could be believed in. So it might be a statement of a particular metaphysics that's very refined.
Which I think you do find in Buddhism, where there was an orthopraxy, where there is this very strong focus on process
and on particular sequences of procedure that guide that process.
Right.
Have to start. These are the foundational practices. These come first.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll throw in here this thing, because Bruce and I were talking before about, I love the idea of typologies of meditation. It seems like I was thinking about that the last couple of days in a different way. I was thinking about it stretched over time. Like, what are the classifications in different historical moments about special attention modes, is how I was thinking about it, right? So in prehistoric human communities, what sorts of experiences would they have that would lead them to be interested in special states of attention, right? Some people have suggested that, like, sort of post-coital experience makes you feel open, right? As if some contractive tension was released. Obviously, the hunting and tracking experiences involve a lot of sustained attending. Obviously, people must have engaged in something like contemplative meditation as problem solving or trying to work things out. They have very natural for some people to have strong somatic interoceptive experiences. So we've got to assume that a certain percentage of the population was running into those experiences all the time. But anyway, you could work out a class of what's likely to have been showing up that would have got people's interest to the point where they thought, oh, maybe we can hack ourselves in this way and do more of this on purpose. And then we move forward to like a sort of traditional thing, which, as Rick was just noting, very often the classical traditions are very formulaic, right? Maybe it's because they're embedded in, authoritarian, scripturally dominated cultures. So you do this and you do this and you do this. And then they come up with these broad, famous categories like Shamta and Vipassana come out of this very traditional mindset. And then later, there's a sort of post-traditional mindset that starts to introduce these innovations that play off that. You get like whatever koans are doing, or whatever self-inquiry is doing in jnana yoga, things like that. You get these they presuppose all of that classical stuff, but then they find these little innovative versions of it. And then we get into a modern sense where the neural attentional modes are being studied, and we're looking at it closely in terms of how it goes with brains and physiology. And so the question would be, where would we want to go next with classification system regimes? And I think it might be interesting to touch in on what we think we've broadly learned in the brain studies department. I mentioned the default mode network stuff that dominates a lot of the discussion. Obviously, left prefrontal cortex focus and generalized open focus meditations have been studied a lot. The transcendental meditation people have funded a lot of their own research into what they consider to be a third type that accesses more of the visual systems in the back and creates a lot of hemispheric coherence. There's some new research on what perspective taking processes do in your brain and how they tend to activate like neuroacoustic tissue, which is interesting. And then the one that always stands out to me because of my background in Gurdjieffianism is multicentric, is how we would call it. Like heart math tracks things that are going on in your chest activity and your head activity. But what about what's going on in your extended peripheral nervous system and different parts of your brain? How are these different neuroelectric networks resonating with each other? That's not been studied very much yet. So those are, in my mind, 4 or 5 general classes of breaking it down neurologically. So before we go any further, I would sort of wonder how you guys think about using brain correlates to think about typologies of meditation in general, B, what you think the general state of that is at the moment and what types of categories have emerged out of that work that you feel have some credibility.
Well, I think there's a positive and a negative about the state of the art. I think it's very promising work for all the reasons that you already just barely touched on. You know, that there's the correlation. That, what does Evan Thompson say? You know, the phenomenology of a practitioner who's been exploring their internal states carefully for long periods of time is able to articulate them quite well, which is what David Chalmers calls that. So there's a name for this, some kind of law he names that if you have access to it, then you can verbalize it or whatever. So, you know, there's a lot of good philosophy and neuroscience that justifies the idea that phenomenologically skilled meditators can help the people monitoring their brain to make the correlations. These are my internal states subjectively described. Oh, this is what's going on, and there's a reliable relationship. So it's promising, but then it's like half of the stuff that you read about the neuroscience of meditation is like what we all found when we found the top 5 ways to meditate on Google. You know, a lot of it is totally hyperbolic and premature in the inferences that are being drawn. A lot of it is branding. You know, speaking of branding and traditions, like I said earlier, I don't know if it was before we put the camera on or not, so I don't want to make it sound like I said this during the recording, but I said something about, oh yeah, my definition of meditation that Thomas Metzinger liked. It was overly loaded with the term philosophy and virtue epistemic and terminology that philosophers would recognize, because I was directing my writing to philosophers to kind of argue to them that meditation is philosophically important, and they're skeptics about it. So many of them are, right? So in the history, because you started with, you know, prehistorical stuff, which was really fascinating, by the way. I love the way that you described the different stages that we went through. You know, Buddhism Buddhism definitely arose within the context of, you know, samanas and the Brahmanism and all that, you know, and they were very procedurally oriented and hot. They were cold too there, but they were hot and cold, and so like they had to carve out a branding for themselves, so to speak, against a kind of worldviews and paradigms that encouraged them to brand and highlight the things about them that were unique, that would maybe be good sales points for people who they wanted to recruit. You know, and there's no doubt that happened. Not only that, but that these traditions explicitly debated each other for support of the local prince or whatever, you know, money for the monastery, all that kind of stuff. So there's that, we know about that. But I'm kind of jumping back because I just wanted to say, you know, there was really interesting stuff that you said leading up to the neuroscience thing, but I have mixed feelings about it. I think you know, the joke is, you're Zen Cohen, we can put the brainoscope on someone and then we could say he's got it and he doesn't, right? And I worry about that because, you know, I don't want anybody to say Repetti doesn't have it. Look at his brain. That's all I'll say for now.
Yeah, I think it's promising. I do like what, you know, like Varela and Natalie DePraz and of course Evan Thompson and others have been doing with their explorations of neurophenomenology. It does seem like it's early stages, but it seems very valuable and that there's a lot to learn. You know, I think one of the things that wasn't mentioned but is often found is the prevalence of types of states that are active or in greater intensity among meditators. So there we can track not only regions of the brain, but also certain kinds of states that seem to become more dominant, or at least the architecture, the arrangement internally of what is more active and what's less active. It shifts, it's remade. And one of the things that I was thinking about, for instance, like John loves to talk about exaptation, something that's exapted. And you could look at meditative disciplines when you were referencing like hacking certain attentional modes, that there's a kind of like exaptation process that I think meditation can be looked at in those terms, that we're learning to use certain neural pathways that have already been established on certain bases in new ways, and with greater degrees of subtlety, and maybe even interlinking some of them to create something novel. But that there is this whole, element of working with the plasticity of the brain and the metaphorical foundations that are there, Lakoff and Johnson, and you can build other things on top of those networks.
Yeah, I thought of this also in terms of what Layman was talking about, the hunter-gatherer. What were the psychotechnologies that we might have actually tried consciously to exact and practice with, like, with cave painting and everything, stuff, some kind of exaptation and cultivation was going on. We just don't know exactly what its mechanics were. But what I thought of when Layman said about focusing on the prey, let's just say, in the hunt, there also had, that's FA, focused attention, but there also had to be peripheral awareness, because you're also a potential prey. So there's that balance. So that mindset, that's a particular meditative technique, right? Focusing on a target while remaining peripherally aware. That's just one example of many different modes that are in our, psychogenetic history that that those could easily explain why this particular culture or tradition managed to, fasten on that psychotechnology as opposed to the other one. But yeah, all of these can and should be, I think, the subject of neuroscientific phenomenological research, and that would help us with the taxonomy. Knowing the functionality, okay, these are people who claim that they're in this ideological tradition and they're using this procedure, but this is what's going on in their brain. And these other people are in that other ideological tradition. They're using this other procedure, but the same thing is going on in their brain. Or these two groups seem to be doing the same thing, but there's different things going on in their brain. What's something differentiating them? We'll look a little deeper, we'll find it. So I love this idea of the neuroscience or neurophenomenology of meditation. I think that's where it does have to go for us to get out of, we're all kind of somewhat susceptible to our perspectival biases, whether it's integral framework or whatever it is, whatever philosophical, like I like Krishnamurti, so I'm a non-structured guy, this kind of thing. But science is science.
There's an interesting thing here. I was thinking about the exaptation idea, right? So that obviously, speech can be exapted to become mantra techniques, or you can notice that you have a certain emotional quality in certain circumstances. You're like, I actually really like that quality. I think I should have more of it. I'm going to sit down and practice it now. I'm going to take it out of its contextual embedding. And there's an interesting thing there that comes up for me around, I don't know if Rick's heard this, I won't go too much into it, but the guy who founded this thing called brain training, Lee Gerdes, initially used these neurofeedback processes that he developed to get himself into positive emotional states. And he was concerned about the possibility of people getting trapped in negative emotional states. So he tried to do that to himself to see what it would be like. And at first, it felt terrible, but as the days went on, it very quickly started to feel really good again. right? So the content that he was exapting quickly became irrelevant, because what he was doing, it seemed like, is giving the brain a higher degree of control over itself. And however you're doing that, it migrates toward a preferred state.
That's fascinating.
I wonder how much, like, if I imagine a civilization of feral yogis in the future, like if everybody had really good portable brain scan devices so that everybody could see when they were in a mode they liked, like the hunter, focused and peripheral, and they go, oh, that was a real sweet spot right there. I was at my best. I could just find that on the screen and get really good at that. So if you just gave everybody one of these things and everybody could just become really good at whatever internal skill they wanted with machine augmentation, would we see a huge diversity, or would we see them over time migrate toward a certain small number of preferred states that are the functional implied targets?
That's a brilliant architectonic for research for a new app, biofeedback app on your phone.
You know, when I won that $5, I felt really good. I'd like to feel that way all the time.
Yeah,
I do like what you brought in, Layman, with the early modes of attention in hunting and gathering. I was thinking about a Vietnamese author who talked about, he was exapting that towards the art of writing, but he was talking about what it takes to write well. And for him, if you just like march with too much force and intention into a forest, you're not going to get what you're really after. Most likely you're going to drive it away. And so there has to be both a clarity of focus, but also such a lightness of touch, such a not only peripheral awareness, but an even hovering, a lightness, and an invisibility, where you have to go into a profound mode of waiting. So it's a kind of like a fundamental learning of a not doing, right? Where so anyway, you can see how that mode of waiting also kind of unfolds interiorly in the contemplative life.
Yeah, especially if let's say you're following the bison all day. So you have a lot of opportunity to see yourself go in and out of different styles of watchfulness.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's really fascinating. Add the fact that bison manure is fertile grounds for psychedelic mushrooms.
Sure. Yeah, that's one of the other. I mean, if we were going to compile primitive special attention modes, clearly entheogenic compounds would be one of the sources that they were then trying to hack themselves into being able to reconnect outside of that state.
So if we're thinking about, taxonomies of meditation, what are the things that we should really focus on? Is it, the article that Rick, you shared, was on certain fundamental activities that are repeated in different contexts? We talked earlier about like the motivation, the functional motivation for doing it. Another option would be to look at what channels the activity moves through, right? So is it a physical activity? Is it a sensory activity? Is it a vocal, subvocal activity? Is it awareness, or there's different parts of the human system that get marshaled in a particular way, and different meditation techniques will work with different aspects of the human system. And again, it doesn't mean that what you're doing with one part of the human system and another part of the human system is actually fundamentally different. They might actually be producing similar things interiorly, whether you're focusing on, subvocalization or putting your awareness in your hand or whatever. They might be doing something similar, but so that's one way to look. There's also like perspectives? Is it like a first person perspective, second person and third person way of approaching things? Or states? Are there certain states that we're aiming at? Is this like a gross practice, a subtle practice, a causal practice, and a non-dual practice? So there are all kinds of ways that we can lay them out, and just that's what I'm part of what I was looking at with this idea of a taxonomy of taxonomies. What are the lenses that we want to choose, and what are the arcs that we might begin to establish among them?
I think they all matter for a comprehensive taxonomy. Every one of these, every mode of being, I think that was one of the first things I was hinting at when I said anything that we do can be done meditatively. And there are probably practices of doing almost anything that we do meditative, or versions of it, something that's somatic or subvocal or whatever, so these are all the different aspects of our being, right? Somatic, emotional, and discursive, whatever. It doesn't matter what it is. There's a version of meditation for every domain and mode in which we exist and engage. So they all matter. So what's common to all of them? Can we say it's some kind of meta-awareness? But then there's that issue, because there are some altered states that don't seem to involve any structural difference, any hierarchical difference. There's no meta there. But those are kind of attainments.
Yeah, well, we might call, it's not necessarily the case that every interesting or even every spiritual state is a meditative state.
That's true.
It's also possible that the spontaneous meditative states that don't seem to have been produced by types of meditative practice may nonetheless have been produced by those practices being engaged without the person's awareness.
Without intention, right, tacit.
But
Especially
to what degree could you be engaged in intentional modification of your internal processes without noticing? Is that a reasonable thing to say could happen?
Well, think about somebody at the gym, even just doing a certain kind of weightlifting thing. They're not, they have maybe a procedure in mind that they want to get strong or whatever it is, but they might be navigating, ways of motivating themselves and being phenomenologically present and all. So like they're triggering in aspects of a meditative mind when they're getting in the zone, but they don't have any conscious articulable, access to the fact that they're doing that. Yeah. Right? That's what you're talking about, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Somebody goes to the gym and they might even have something. I got to keep your eye on the prize, or they have something that you could unpack as a meditation instruction. Yeah. But if you ask them, they wouldn't say they were doing any meditating. And right. Yet the results might be very analogous to meditation procedures.
Yeah, particularly when you think of Csikszentmihalyi's zones, all his zone research, being in the flow, the zone, all sorts of people who practice some other art that's not itself being practiced because it's a meditative art, wind up exapting all these meditative things that are already in our psychology, because our ancestors were hunter-gatherers, let's just say. So we have those abilities to focus and peripheral and this and that, and
Bruce, I liked what you were saying about. It problematizes the whole thing, right? Like what parts of us are involved. Because sometimes I think about ways of, because my whole spiritual spiel is about integration surplus modes. Mm-hmm. But if you're doing a practice like Tai Chi, where you're bringing kind of your mind and your somatic sensing together, then you might get certain kind of result that we point to as a type of Chi comes out. But that's a little bit different than the type of, let's say, animal magnetism or something you might get by bringing a lot of emotional response into equilibrium with your physical performances and things like that. So I'm interested on the one hand in how the different combinations of systems being brought together in practices produce different results. But on the other hand, if you're leading somebody through a hypnotherapeutic induction, it doesn't matter whether you ask them to focus on a spot on the wall or on an imaginary quality in their mind. It's the directed focus regardless of what systems are being used and what targets are being brought up that cause the general effect. So if, like you were saying, depending on what we want to look at, we get whole different kinds of options for categorization.
Yeah, two things. There's, you mentioned people just spontaneously are in states that could be neurologically studied and say, they're in the state, but they have no conscious. So there's that. But then there are people like Krishnamurti who just, go outside and look at the leaves or whatever, and poof, he's in a meditative state. But he's also somebody who had a sadhana practice for, 20 years before he decided to go structureless or whatever, almost as a revolt against that system. Kind of lost my train of thought. That was the first of two things. The second one will come back to me.
Well, let me point to something that's similar to that, which is there's a beautiful dialogue recorded between Bhagwan Rajneesh and Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and some of his students, right? I think it's from the 70s. And Rajneesh is saying, you guys have a deliberate methodological practice. The thing I'm calling meditation is no aim, no goal, no practice at all. You aren't really doing it as long as your ego is grasping onto the idea of a method. And so they kind of argue with him for a while. And then at the end, Maharishi says, it's always like this. People who've had a lot of success in their method no longer need their method. And they tell other people you don't need any methods.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that's like, what's his name? Trungpa, right? The tantric. Smoking, drinking, whatever. He's pretty evolved. I forget, somebody criticized him to his teacher, and then the teacher gave a kind of answer like that, like he can afford to fool around like that. I'm really badly paraphrasing. The thing I remember
a quote from him, which is, I can't really do the voice, but he had that car accident that left his lungs impaired, so he had sometimes this high voice. And anyway, I remember there's a recording of him saying to his students, if I didn't smoke and drink, you wouldn't even be able to see me.
Yeah. And like he was a rascal, and a left-handed path guy and all that. But Ramakrishna, who's kind of like one of these pious, devout, Puritan kind of Vedantists, he also smoked and ate meat to keep him in his body. So, yeah. So I remember the second thing that I was thinking of, and it's what I call the circularity problem. In Buddhism, there's the three marks, impermanence and no self and unsatisfactoriness of, existential, whatever you want to call it. But those ideological lenses are built into the meditation instructions. You are to look for those things. By paying attention in a certain way, you're guaranteed to see that things are impermanent, right? And impersonal. But that's almost like, if you look very closely at the pixels, then they disappear, But if you look a certain way, you don't see a certain thing. It doesn't mean it's not there, right? So there's a circularity, The branding of Buddhism is that the meditation cushion is your empirical lab where you find out that these three truths are true, right? But the methodology kind of guarantees that. So it's circular. So it's not really some kind of unbiased discovery. It's more like a production. So there's a way in which so many of the meditative traditions are guilty of that kind of, whether it's Vedanta, it's the, almost every system has this background ideology that infuses the procedure and everything else. I don't remember why I brought that up, but it's part of the problem, I think, of taxonomizing things.
One of the ways that I've looked at that in the context of what we were calling the integral post-metaphysical spirituality is there is that circularity, and in a sense it's just this reinforcing where the practices almost exist to confirm the dogma. right. And there's that circularity there. But you could also say, I think inactively, if we're looking at it, that there is basically a mode of being that's desired. And if we look at it, you can see how the traditions have mastered certain ways to transform the individual to conform to particular enacted modes of being. So if we see it in a participatory and an integral pluralistic light, we can let go necessarily of the expectation that where they're arriving with their spiritual training corresponds necessarily to a pre-given reality, but instead it's a negotiation, a participatory negotiation, that this community wants to, within this context, exhibit these traits, and they have disciplines that are pretty good at bringing them to this particular mode, enacted mode of being. And so then we can look at basically, what are the techniques and the conceptual stances and other things that go into the production, into the enactment of a desired mode of being.
That's a good positive spin, and I don't mean to use that term as a disparaging term. I mean, that's another way of justifying or kind of coming to grips with or dealing with the circularity problem was from one of the contributors to my handbook, Karsten Stroll. He argued that you could look at it the way Imre Lakatos looks at research programs. There's a kind of feedback loop where, okay, you've got this expectation, ideology, you test it, and then, but there's a feedback loop. It's like theories in science. They just kind of keep improving. Paradigms shift over the course of time. When they reach the limit of whatever they can produce, there's a similar framing to what you were saying.
Right.
Just different terminology, but the same idea.
Yeah, there's something
There's a kind of pragmatic assumption there.
Yes.
Right.
Go ahead, Layman.
What good physicists have in common is they understand the limits of physics, so to speak, right? So there's a movement towards some kind of maturational capacity that can be put forward in these communities. But I think one of the aspects of the circular problem that makes it even more slippery is, how do we know it's working? Right? Because one of the circular things is the likelihood that people will say that it's working, or they'll be pointed to as examples of you called it a mastery of enacting these things, Bruce, but are they? How do we know which communities are any good at doing it?
Right.
Yeah, and how much of this is going on?
Yeah.
Here's it being squeezed.
Right.
I like the example because it just so easily brings up the problem. It's kind of simplistic, and that can be helpful, like an intuition pump. Yeah. Yeah, good question. Well, that's where the neuroscience comes in. We want to put brainoscopes on people and find out, are you guys all just, selling your brand? You've got a good narrative. It looks good. You're not even in the default network right now.
Yeah, there could be. I mean, to use the integral mapping idea, right? You're like, well, maybe you got 4 quadrants of checking or something like that, right? How does the individual feel? Has their life changed? What's their brain doing? And what do the other people feel about them if they actually check how they feel about them? Because a lot of cults, pseudo-meditative cults, are like, oh, you look at the people at the top and you're like, that's not very impressive. Is no one in the group even checking whether they want to progressively become like those guys?
I remember I was co-teaching a contemplative ethics class at Vassar College with a good friend of mine who's a professor of religion there, Rick Repetti. And our students, we began every class with meditation, and we did readings about contemplation and about ethics. We tried to get them to be ethically engaged, kind of like engaged secular Buddhism kind of approach. And one of the students, I forget how it came up, about enlightened beings, aspiring to become, whatever those things are. And one of the students asked, how can you tell if someone's enlightened? And my friend Rick said, ask their spouse. Right? Someone who sees them when they're not in front of the cult,
Interpersonal verification has to be one of the tactics, alongside with neurological verification.
Brain scans and wives, those are or husbands.
Something I've been it's been bubbling up in my mind for the last few minutes is making two categories might be a place to start, right? Classically, Buddhism points at Shantha and Vipassana, and those are sometimes very narrowly defined. I tend to take them in a very general sense. Like insight meditation is a certain application of an idea to what's arising rather than holding your attention on something. And they give you some in Buddhism that you're supposed to look for, like you were saying, but you could also look for a number of different kinds of things. So that's one way to go. Are you doing a general focus on something, or are you applying a method to whatever your attention is doing? Or we can go to active and passive is an interesting approach I've heard people use. And for me, that begs the question of whether the passive ones are passive or not. Right? When Tom Murray talks about ablative methods, or you're letting things go, but are you letting things go, or are you adding the letting go-ness to what you're already doing? Right? Is it, where are we receptive and where are we active?
The paradox of non-doing.
Yeah. So what do we think about if you had to break meditation into two categories just to start with? What would we do? Where would we like to start on that?
I was thinking along those lines of receptive and concentration. So it's very similar to what you're saying. Some is the kind of the letting go and letting be and seeing what happens, and the other one is more focused attention. And that I was taking from Washburn. I was thinking about his description of what happens in meditation based on those modes. He looks at it as a receptive meditation. It encourages you to kind of let go of what habitually is being done at a particular level. And as you get successful in letting go of that particular activity, of conscious activity, what the kind of material and activity that busyness tended to obscure comes forward. And he describes a process of how as you move through that, you can go into deeper and deeper layers of the unconscious and the self structure by having progressive levels of the self first come into attention, and then through non-engagement, basically release and progressively take you further into where, until he would say you get to what he calls the repression barrier, where often the meditators end up in a desert and nothing's happening anymore. They've gone deep enough, but now they're at the repression barrier, and they can stay there for years in his account, before something bubbles up. So that's one kind of geological mapping way. But what he would say is the converse approach is that they both actually do something similar, but that with concentration, you zero in on a point and you don't notice anything along the way, but you go very, very, very deep, and you achieve a kind of deep stabilization. And it's only when you come out of the deep focused meditation in the concentration practice that in coming back you might become aware of different layers of your being that you had kind of pushed through to that point of intensity, and then coming back, those things show up in awareness.
I love everything and agree with everything that I've heard. I would add to it something we've already acknowledged many times, which is the difference between practices and states. So we're talking about practices right now, right? But that's an important distinction. All different ways of finding yourself in or getting yourself into states, or engaging in practices that tend to engender more of those spontaneously arising meditative states. So anybody who has a long-term practice finds themselves, even when they're not practicing, falling into, or just the meditative states just kind of bubbling up in their lives. But sticking with the practices, right? I like the distinction, though the seventh and the eighth step and the eightfold path, or however which way you want to define them, I think they are both versions of the same thing. That's something that I would like to point out. One, they both involve choosing a scope of focus. One is a narrow scope and one is a broad scope. So the receptive one, which is like in the sensory motor cortex, it's the sensory modality. But both of them involve a motor. Like, are you not doing? Both of them involve, so you say, I'm going to be open awareness, open monitoring, choiceless awareness, whatever you want to call it, and just receive whatever's there. When you start daydreaming and you're not in that state anymore, that's like if you're trying to focus on your breath and your mind went here, you realize it and you bring it back. Okay, so you want to stay here, but you wound up there and you realize it and you bring it back. So the exact same functional muscle is occurring, which is a doing. It's an exertion of some sort. So, that's agency. There's some kind of meditative agency in whether you're staying in the broad or the narrow focal range. There's agency required to stay there, which is motor theoretic. But whether you're paying attention narrowly or broadly, that's sensory theoretic or receptive. So those are some of the theoretical lenses that I would add to what both of you said. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's some general category of choice and attention in a context that's meant to do something for us. And the something it's meant to do converges, but is not quite the same as these spontaneous states. So then you've got that thing, and then if you were going to subdivide that thing, then you would be choosing a very wide angle lens or choosing a very narrow lens. You'd be doing roughly the same practice, but you'd be doing it in different styles. And then each of those could be subdivided into what informational territory, right, are you parsing that lens toward? It can be very wide or very narrow in somatic experience or perceptual experience or, cognitive, whatever.
Your understanding.
Like that's a good starting place for typologies.
I was thinking about various kind of meditative polarities and different kinds of polar emphases that you can see that I think along the lines of what we're talking about here, you could possibly see them as two sides of the same thing. So I was thinking of receptive meditation versus concentration, skill developing versus deconstructive or clearing, reinforcement of traits versus not doing, calming versus amplifying, identification versus disidentification, rational analytic versus transrational paradoxical. So we have these different kinds of polarities that I think we can find sometimes only one side emphasized in a tradition, but sometimes both held together.
Yeah, we have a bias as humans toward using dyads to organize information. And so we're never sure whether it should be 3 or 7 or 2, right?
Right.
I was thinking when you said that, like there's concentration and there's reception, but the same way that the transcendental meditation people want to come in and go, yeah, you got your concentration and your open focus, but there's also this other one. Maybe you should have 3 as your starting place.
Right.
When I was talking, the second last conversation I had with Jill Nephew around the app she's building to automate open-ended inquiry, right? So there's something in that discussion we talked about. It's reception. You're exploring what's going on in you. It's that kind of an intentional wide angle receiving of the process. But one of the things I brought up for is that there's a way of asking questions as a meditative technique in which you are interested in having a look. And there's a way of asking questions in which you are not interested in receiving anything. You're interested in the effect that the gesture of the question has on your system, which is to release you from something. So there's a question here where, for me, whether that's a subset of the reception style or whether that's a third style, and really we shouldn't confine ourselves to two.
Right.
Wow. I'm curious about that app.
Yeah, it's called Inquire. They're trying to just have a safe, automated space where people do a walkthrough of unresolved issues by applying different lenses. It's got its flaws, but the general idea of setting up apps like that seems very promising. You could digitally augment certain forms of self-insight practice.
Sounds fascinating. Yeah, in terms of different, radically different or three different ways of thinking of something that you normally think of dyadically or whatever, like Socratic dialogue, for example. There's so many ways of understanding that. You've got John Vervaeke's anagogic thing. He's got a really rich dialogos interpretation of all of that. There's the, like you said, there's the asking of questions just for the kind of perplexing impact that asking the questions could have on you, which is something like aporia, the uncertainty that the dialogues end in. But then there's the kind of philosophical Socratic inquiry that tries to actually articulate and come to answers. And then there are blends of both, and there's just so many different ways of.
And then is there something else that's building up the whole time, right? Like if there's let's say, intensification of metacognitive capacity arising as a result of doing any of these things, that if you were to investigate communities over time, how much of the results we're seeing are from the particular choice subset of the meditation practice, and how much is an accumulating result from simply doing any of the practices, and it really doesn't matter which one you're choosing.
Yeah, that I think the answer is, well, there are probably some very simple instrumental things like, you put a quarter in the machine and you get a gumball, cause and effect. So there's certainly ways in which this technique will more reliably lead to that goal quicker than that technique. Like one-pointedness leads to shamatha quicker than, let's just say, the open monitoring thing does. But that depends on the person. If you've been doing this for years, the open monitor, you could just kind of go into a kind of zazen mode like automatically. But I tend to believe personally, and I don't know if this is just, a bias of mine, that it's the latter suggestion. Like any of these things will have some kind, what was the example you used? Somebody who used a negative emotion trick, but then, he wound up just, exapting that, and his kind of magnetic north was a positive outcome for him once he opened up that metacognitive tool. That's a metacognitive tool. So opening, I think, as a generalization, I said something about this in my dissertation originally, almost any kind of metacognitive activity will increase our agential array of affordances in some way, shape, or form. Just opening up and using any of that muscle will have this kind of reciprocal opening for other things like it in your psyche.
There's one thing we haven't touched on is the role that value and values play in all of this, because when you were saying that, you were recalling that the example I gave of the guy who used the negative emotional state. What popped into my mind is a statement from Nietzsche that I love, where he said, he who despises himself still esteems himself as one who despises. Right. So on the surface level, you're looking at a negative, but actually you're making contact with your positive value in doing the evaluating act itself. And one of the things that's been languaged in all of these practices is the role that you're doing something you think is valuable when you're doing meditation. You're establishing some kind of relation to some value. So that may be important in defining what it is, but also in thinking about its possible typology.
That was really well said. Very insightful. I love that Nietzsche quote and the way that you explained it and applied it. Very well said. It kind of harkened me back to the first step in the Eightfold Path being view, how that informs intention. So, your view has a value. Like, this is worth pursuing. That's part of view. And then that informs your practice, what you pursue. So you can't get around it. Any desire, any volition that we have tacitly presupposes an underlying value evaluation. If you want anything, now this is like kind of logical analysis, almost a Humean analysis, right? Like, actions don't just happen. They're motivated, but I'm adding something to it that's kind of like what you're saying. Like, there's an implicit value there. Every desire parses the world into the way it is as it is now. This is the becoming thing, right? I want something means I want to change the way the world is, which means, right, to get what I don't have, whatever it is. So that there's a value presupposed by that's better than this. So value's always there, even cynically valuing yourself. I love that. You are implicitly adopting the moral agent stance of assigning a negative value to, even yourself. There's no escaping the positivity of value.
Yeah, there's an interesting spiritual path available through that relates to view. Like, I always think of it as, if you find south on a compass, you know where the North Pole is in the same moment, right? So you have a view choice. If something's problematic, then you're connecting to a positive value, and you could reorient to the positive value. And if you taught yourself that skill, then you would reorient to the positive as a result of every negative. And then you would have a kind of omnipositive experience as a result of encountering dukkha.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about the two types. I don't know that we really need to break it down to two types, but I was thinking, actually comparing Castaneda and Dzogchen, which is maybe an unusual thing, though I did one day driving out in the desert, I met a Japanese Shingon monk wandering across the desert, and ended up giving him a ride. And he talked to me later. We formed a friendship, and he talked to me later that he studies Castaneda because he said that was the closest Western practice system that he had ever encountered that mirrored what he does on Mount Koyasan with his Shingon monastery in terms of the types of things that they get up to. He felt that there was such a strong accord, he couldn't believe it. So what I wanted to mention there, though, is, and it maybe could relate to Gurdjieff also, since Layman just had a Gurdjieff conversation, but in Castaneda, there's the two types of stalking and dreaming. And stalking basically is all of those practices that find out ways in which we are being self-thwarting and wasteful and squandering of energy. And it's basically marshaling attention to up-level ourselves in terms of our own internal coherence and functionality. And then dreaming is the practice, kind of the practice of freedom that becomes available once you've harnessed your energy and plugged the leaks, right? Then you've basically lifted the well water up, and you're now able to have a fuller field of play in which dreaming work happens, and it becomes capacitated by that cleanup work, right? And similarly in Dzogchen, it's not exactly a parallel, but there's trekche and there's turgal, and trekche means kind of the preparatory cutting through practices of like a lot of yoga and energy work kind of practices, and and a clarifying of attention and a stripping away. And then turgal is the soaring, where there's the mind that's kind of liberated and free in its own condition, because it's had that preparatory work. So I think we could look across traditions and see that there are a number of different practices which are basically kind of self-maintenance and resource marshaling exercises. And then there are practices that are what you can do, once you've basically done that initial work to improve the system.
Yeah, there are elements of Gurdjieff that are like that in terms of sort of not leaking, having a good container. But one of the things that stood out to me when you were saying that is a kind of two-phase approach to looking at meditation practices, where the first phase involves, you're applying intention across internal systems of some kind, and you're getting side effect metacognition production. But as you get metacognitive stability of various kinds, then engaging with and using that also becomes a set of practices. Now, maybe you never stop doing the first set,
right.
But you now have a second set, which sort of goes by itself or takes advantage of new capacities that are afforded by the successes of the first phase.
I think
they might look like a whole different set or different set of types of meditation practices.
I was just going to say only a parenthetical. I don't know if Rick wants to jump in there, but a parenthetical is that relates to your whole, I think, integration surplus model. There's a lot of things that help generate the surplus, but then there's what do you do with the surplus?
Yeah.
And so I think those are the two phases, right?
Yeah, that's brilliant analysis, and you could see easily how it applies to so many different systems, just like the 8 limbs of yoga practice. The first few are grounding and clearing and cleaning and purifying and, getting your act together and developing some discipline and all of that. And then the late stage is, samadhi. But that also loosely maps on to my distinction between practices and states. So once you've got the leaks blocked, then the states just start happening. But then there's also technologies to, go into this state and that state and the other state. And
yes, states are. We need a typology of states as well.
And then
one thing is there's states that are like ontologies. They're like, oh, I've accessed the subtle state or the non-dual state, and there's states that are like particular. Oh, I got into loving kindness, but then there's a type of state which is general and could take any of those forms. Which is I've established X amount. I've got some coherence more than I need right now that's going by itself. And it may take the form of any of those, but now I can play off it somehow.
Yeah, and that reminded me, traits. So there's practices, states, and traits. And traits are important. But there's also this guy, I don't know if you read that book called Altered Traits, I think it was, by Davidson and Goldman. Richie Davidson and Danny Goldman, 2017, Altered Traits. There's some monk in there who was like their poster boy for how meditation really works. And they did the brain scans of him, and his brain age is something like 40 years younger than his actual chronology. But he's also in some kind of global state of awareness all the time, which shows this, I think it's called gamma synchrony, the actual brain wave state. And that totally maps onto the phenomenology of him saying, I'm just in this open, totally receptive place. But that's a trait for him and a state, but it certainly practices that led to him being that way.
Yeah, that's a really rich area for the neuroscience part to investigate, is because you would expect traits, if they stabilize, to be anchored in some sort of concrete biological change. Right? Are we seeing more interlinking pathways in his cortex, or what are we seeing that's now made this part of how the organism behaves on a regular basis?
Well, his baseline brainwave states, even when he's not meditating, are more global, like global gamma synchrony. Whatever that range, there's a range of numbers that go with that. And when he's in meditative states consciously and says he is, that's like maximal. It's through the roof. You never see that. I think it happens in ordinary people only when they have multiple sensory unification at the same time. But his baseline state is in that range when he's doing anything else.
There's sometimes I talk to myself about the alpha gamma problem, because in the late 20th century, particularly in the 70s, there was a lot of talk about meditation being an attempt to get into a meditative state, which they associated with alpha brainwaves. You're going to drop down into a slightly more chill mode of being.
The hypnagogic mode.
Exactly. And so that's very nice, and it's very relaxing, and it's an appropriate antidote to modern Western society. And so it's favored in a certain way. But they didn't really know about high performance gamma frequencies. And anything that you describe as like sort of akin to Wilbur's pre-trans fallacy. If you're going to get out of normal beta wave dominant consciousness, does that mean slipping down to alpha, or does that mean expanding to gamma? And the descriptions can be very similar. In both cases, there's some apparent releasing of the normal consciousness and normal thought procedures. So it suggests that there may be beyond two, there could be a number of different types of ways of going outside of a normal that we don't notice are different, because they're all being related back to their difference to normal.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. I like the comparison with the pre-trans fallacy thing. Kids are not enlightened, and people in the alpha state, beginner meditators, I think when they put the scan on them, they go right into the, that lower, there's fully waking, and then there's the in-between state, and then dreams and dreamless. They go into the in-between state like really quickly. So what? Feels good, but then that's what's being sold. I got there. It was great. I did my 20 minutes in the meditation bus that came outside the office, or with my Headspace app. That's all good. There's nothing wrong with all of that. But yeah, it's not just that like, that gamma thing is just more of that alpha thing. That's the other model, right? And lots of beginning meditators say, I can't meditate because I didn't even get into that alpha mode.
I bring it up with koans a lot, because there's a difference of how you make koans workable for yourself. In one sense, it's an unresolvable problem. So the significance is, you can't use your mind to access the state of consciousness we're pointing to, let it go. The other mode is, no, you have to really try hard to solve this unsolvable puzzle, which is going to jack you up into a high performance breakthrough mode. And yet the instruction sounds very similar in both cases, and conceals a typological difference in the meditative practice.
Yeah. Well, look, I should have mentioned this when we started, but I have a 12 o'clock.
Okay.
So we have about 5 minutes left or so.
I just got a ding for a meeting starting in 5 minutes also, so this is perfect.
Okay.
Spontaneous wind down.
Yeah. Well, I think ending on the note about two ways of understanding koans is a really
because this is a koan.
Aphoretic way to end this discussion, but I think we made a lot of progress. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work to be done in this area.
Yeah, I can hardly imagine where we would go if we did another one, but I kind of want us to do another one. Anyway, it's fantastic, because this is, I think, such an important conversation. Like I was saying before, that people need to be having this conversation. A lot of the great meditators have not been doing the philosophical work, and the philosophers have not been doing the meditative work, and they've certainly not been cross-pollinating each other and doing it in a rich intersubjective fashion. And I think that's absolutely what we need to move toward.
Yeah, I think, just having this conversation with you is very synchronicity wise. I don't know if that came out the right way, but there's synchronicity in it, because having just come out with that book on the philosophy of meditation with 26 different authors, and there were another 26 who could have and should have, but were too busy, like Thomas Metzinger. He was just too busy to write. I want to start doing a podcast series inviting all of those people and people like you and whatnot to just talk about the philosophy of meditation. But a really good way to drive that is to have this conversation with every single one of them. We need to talk about the taxonomy of it before we could really go much further. I mean, of course, with different authors who's focused on this or that, when I have them on the show, I'll talk to them about what their research is. But that's something that I want to hit on in every I have to ask every one of them, what's your taxonomy?
Oh, fantastic. What a pleasure, guys. This was great.
Yeah. Yeah. And after I make a little progress on my own taxonomy, I will run it by you guys. And we'll do another one of these, but we could do it before then. I think we could have gone another 2 hours today easily.
Yeah, let's do that at some point. Any last thoughts, Bruce?
I'd wanted to hear more personal stories about types of meditation we'd worked with, and to see our own take on the kind of effects and things that they've had for us, and how that might play into our privileged typologies. So
let's do another one and have it be more relating of experience based.
Yeah, we said we were going to do that, but then we went off trying to taxonomize everything. All right. Awesome. We'll do that next time. All right.
Enjoy your next meetings.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Take care.
My next meeting is a meditation, actually, that I'm guiding on the campus. So, ironically. All right, folks.
Cheers.
Take care.